geopolitics has a lot of culture, political culture in it, statecraft culture in it. And the United States and Britain have their own distinctive political cultures that are changing themselves, of course, but should be understood. Both Britain and the U.S. were formed as evangelical Protestant societies. That means they had a self-image of evangelizing the world, saving the rest of the world. And so the British Empire, as it was exploiting the rest of the world, said it was civilizing the rest of the world. It was the white man's burden, is the famous expression, to save the rest of the world. And the United States has a lot of that Christian evangelical spirit as well. And it's a very distinctive kind of culture because remember that British colonists, Puritans came to the East Coast of the United States at a time when it was basically, of course, a continent of native Amerindian populations. This wasn't an empty place. And during the roughly 300 years period, this white Christian evangelical group ended up conquering North America in a kind of crusade or series of crusades. And in the middle of the 19th century, it was called Manifest Destiny, that this was a religious destiny of white people to rule over North America. And there was definitely always a strong racial component to the imperial transoceanic rule as well. So it wasn't just that Britain and the United States got to the steam engine first. They really believed in a mission of, civilization. Of course, the French had their own civilisatrice, that we are civilizing the world. And there was a lot of grotesque pseudoscience in the late 19th century that followed Darwin, but in a pseudoscientific way of race superiority, which turned into Nazism in its most extreme variant. But that was also part of the idea that Europe was destined to rule the world. Now, the United States is geographically separated by two large oceans from the rest of the world. Global geography is not exactly the strong suit of the United States. I don't think that 1 in 100 Americans could point to Indonesia on the map, probably. And because we're between two very large oceans. And so when you combine several things, the U.S. is having a hard time. First, the U.S. was absolutely dominant economically at the end of World War II. It was the only place still standing. And the war had been phenomenal for the U.S. economy. The U.S. had 1 day of direct war. That was December 7, 1941, when Japan attacked the naval base at Pearl Harbor. Other than that, the United States was unscathed in its territory, built up incredible industry, had one scientific breakthrough after another, radar and rocketry and so many other things, and semiconductors that would become the basis of the next generation of technological breakthroughs and so forth. So first, there was the U.S. dominance. There was the geopolitical dominance. There was the evangelical spirit that, of course, the U.S. runs the world. Who else? We're out to save the world. That's a deeply believed view. Weird, but really believed. And there's a lot of ignorance because, I can tell you, growing up in Detroit, Michigan, I didn't learn a lot of global history or global geography. It took me a lifetime to learn what I know, and only in part by traveling the world almost nonstop for the last 40 years. because it doesn't come naturally to someone in middle America. So when you put all those pieces together, the U.S. has this sense, even Biden expressed it. Of course, he's an old man, decades out of tune with reality, in my opinion. But he said, we're the indispensable country. The whole world looks to us for leadership. Huh? I travel the world. Does the world look to the U.S. for leadership? No. Yeah. The world looks to the U.S. for, please, be normal. Stop your wars. Don't overthrow us. Cooperate. Keep your trade open. Not for your saving us. But, in the American mentality, there is still this idea that the U.S. is the leader and it's going to save the world. So there's a lot of culture in this. By the way, there's a lot of culture everywhere in politics. If you look at Russian politics, you see a lot of Russian culture that's centuries old. If you look at Chinese statecraft, you see statecraft that was formed over 2,000 years. It's not something. This is fascinating for me because technology changes very fast, but cultural ideas are really deeply embedded and don't change so fast and are not well understood across international boundaries. Now, you asked, therefore, about diplomacy. The U.S. is just bad at it. Diplomacy for the U.S. is, we'll tell you what to do. And even when the U.S. is so far from being able to tell anyone what to do, the mentality is still that. And so I just think American diplomats are rude, first of all, because, I've learned in 40 years something about dealing with other societies. Respect is a very key part of that. But the American approach is not respect. The American approach is, here are 10 things you need to do. Now, with a small country, that can still sometimes work, although even not so often. But with China, are you kidding? Right. To be rude to China, you think you're going to get something positive out of being rude and tough to China? And yet that's the American approach. So America's extremely weak at diplomacy right now. Right. I would start with a course in etiquette, frankly. I would start with a course in good manners, which the U.S. really needs. I've worked with 3 secretaries generals of the UN. That's a very tough job, but the first rule of that job is be polite. You've got 193 countries that you have to respond to, and everyone from the tiniest to the largest expects respect. Yeah. So this is the first thing I would try to teach American diplomats. Well, first, I wouldn't call it spending on defense. I would call it spending on military because it's got a lot of offense in it. It's about war making. Yeah, no. And I think there's another problem, which is generals want to try out their new weapons. And when you have a large military, it's very hard anyway to just have it sit there. You could do training and so on, but part of the fact, weird as it sounds, and I don't think I'm being naive, when you have a huge military outlay, you tend to use it, by the way, and the U.S. is constantly using it in theater operations, in local operations, and so on. It's quite exaggerated and dangerous. Remember, because of this history of the U.S. empire after World War II, the U.S. has 800 overseas military bases in about 80 countries. My God, that's a lot, much too much. I actually think there should be an international norm and rule that nobody should station their troops outside of their national borders. Wouldn't that be interesting? We couldn't have these wars. And it makes perfect sense. Your military should be for defense, and it should not be for offense. You should not have networks of vast overseas bases. By the way, the only 2 countries that have huge networks of bases are the United States and Britain. Britain completely as a legacy, of course. It's, a small island, not very economically strong right now, but it still has military bases all over the world, essentially used by the United States, by the way. These are places where U.S. aircraft can land or get refurbished or get rearmed and so on. But I think the point is we need a completely different multilateral approach. There's a doctrine that I really like in the UN system, back to the UN Charter, but then really amplified in international law in the 1960s, and that is non-intervention. The idea is don't intervene in the internal affairs of other countries. You can have diplomacy with them, but don't meddle in their internal affairs. Now, if we abided by that norm, we wouldn't have these wars, actually. If the United States did not have military bases abroad, there would never be a war in Ukraine now, because the war in Ukraine emerged because the United States was trying to push NATO into Ukraine and actually into Georgia and in the eastern boundary of the Black Sea as part of a strategy that goes back to Britain in 1856. Britain already had the idea under Lord Palmerston that you should surround Russia in the Black Sea region to limit Russia's capacity to project power. And Palmerston pursued the Crimean War between 1853 and 1856 to kick the Russian fleet out of the Black Sea.